Hello everyone. In this presentation we're going to go through the process of developing research questions. So for the research question assignment, I know this is very early in the course and you may be thinking, well gosh, I don't know enough. I haven't completed all the lit review yet. The reason for that is we want to get you started on developing a question that you can revise and refine. So I consider this research question assignment a draft. So I'm going to give you feedback on your questions and help you refine them into something that could actually be studied. There's a tendency of folks who are new to this, myself included when I was starting out, to take on too much in one question. Research questions address very narrow issues. So you may have a broad topic that you're interested in. And by now I hope that you've decided on a topic that you want to focus on. And then research builds very incrementally, one small piece at a time. So we're going to be looking at the process of, first of all, identifying an area, and then within that area some specific issues that need to be addressed, and then refining that down to one specific research question that you could design a study. So this presentation parallels the section in Chapter 3 of the Ledford and Gast text. So if you haven't done so, stop watching this right now. Read Chapter 3, at least the first half of Chapter 3. That's where the authors really address the issue of research questions. Okay, if you're still listening, I assume that you've read that chapter. So why should you write a research question? Well, questions are extremely important because they drive research. As you're going to learn as we go through the research designs, we select research designs based on the question we're trying to answer. The research designs work differently, and some of them facilitate answering some questions but not others. So you have to start out with a question. Research is all about trying to answer questions. So first things you want to talk about, or first things you should consider, a research question helps you clarify the goals of a study. Without a question to guide you, we can mess around with things that may not help us. So it helps us be very focused on addressing certain goals. And once we have goals, then we can look at what are the action steps. What do we need to do to address these goals? Or how can we meet the purpose of a study? So it defines what we're actually going to do. Once we know what we're going to do, then we have to make some decisions that will help us move forward. One of the first decisions is we have to look at who will participate in the study. What group of individuals or what characteristics of the participants are we interested in looking at? So, for example, we may see from reading our research, for example, that a lot of the work with social skills has been done with adolescents with emotional and behavioral disorders, with young children with autism, but maybe there's almost nothing with adults with emotional and behavioral disorders, let's say. So that may be an area that you want to focus on for your research. Also, what things are you going to measure? So in order to answer this research question, what data do we need to address that? And that helps us really focus on what we're going to measure. We have to be careful about what we measure in a study. If we try to measure too many things or too much, we can dilute our results. We can decrease the effectiveness by which we're actually measuring what we're interested in. So we want to focus on measuring just a few things, and sometimes just one thing, that's going to lead directly to answering our research question. So as we talk more about measures and how we choose measurement strategies, we're going to always link that back to the specific research question that we're trying to answer. It also helps us make decisions about the procedures. Now the procedures are basically it's a task analysis of the study. So when we write procedures, we go through each step of conducting the research with enough detail that another person could take our procedures and replicate our study as closely as possible. So we want to give enough detail, and it's presented in the sequence in which we would do it. So the procedures would first start out with, how do we select participants? What are our criteria for including participants and excluding participants? How many participants are we using? Where are we conducting the research? What's the setting? What's the type of environment? And then what do we actually do? How do we collect baseline data? How do we implement an intervention? And then what specific things do we measure as we're implementing the intervention? How do we measure the inter-observer agreement for data collection? How do we measure the fidelity of implementation for the intervention that we're implementing? So all of those pieces go into the procedures. It's a very important section. So the research question drives the selection of the research design. We're going to learn a lot about individual single case research designs and how they work. For example, if my research question is related to an instructional strategy or a way of teaching something, for example, and I'm interested in just how well it works, so we're going to learn that this is a demonstration type question. One approach I could use is I could pick 3 or 4 participants that need to work on the same skill, and I could collect baseline data on all of them, and then I could implement the instructional strategy with participant 1, and when that participant shows improvement, then I'll implement it with participant 2, and then finally I'll implement it with participants 3 and 4. So I'll sequentially implement it across those 4 participants, and I can show that that individual's dependent measures, or the measure by which so let's say it's percentage correct responses, I can show that that only changes when I implement the intervention and not before. So that type of research design is called a multiple baseline design, and it works really well for that type of research question. Another type of research design is called a reversal design. That's when you have baseline, you implement the intervention, then you remove the intervention, and what you're looking for is does the participant's behavior return to baseline levels? And then you put the intervention back, and then you may take it away again. So it's like called an A-B design. Well, that'll work for something like differential reinforcement schedules. Let's say I'm doing a DRO schedule, and I put it in place and I show improvement, I remove it, and the person's behavior goes back to where it was. Then I put it back in place again, the person's behavior improves again. So that would work for a DRO. It would not work for an instructional procedure, because once I teach something, just because I remove that intervention isn't going to magically make the person forget. So the different designs answer different questions. So you have to have a good, solid research question before you can even think about the type of research design that would be appropriate. So with research designs, you start out with a broad topic. How do you pick a topic? Well, first and foremost, it needs to be something that you are interested in, because you're going to be reading a lot about it. So pick something that you want to learn more about. And I see now I've got strutty instead of study. Sorry about that. So think about the work that you do, or the work you're interested in doing, and what are some problems that you've seen occur. Research questions are built on, sometimes to address certain problems or issues. So what things have you observed that you believe some research or study could improve the field? So what things are you interested in? Then you start looking at research that has already been done. You're going to be doing that right now. You should be selecting some research articles and reading them. So at least 5 right now. You should have identified 5 research articles related to some topic you're interested in. You start reading those. So has someone else already addressed that question, or has a lot of research already been done that addresses the question? Then you have to decide, was this something I really need to study or study? Are there some gaps? Well, let me tell you, there are always gaps in the research. Studies address very specific issues. So what is a good place to look for in the discussion section of any good research report? The author always talks about further research. So if you look at 5 studies and you look at the discussion sections, do you see some common themes popping up? Does everyone say, yeah, we've done a good bit of research in this area, but almost none of it's in a classroom setting. All of this research is in clinical settings. So then your research question may be, does this intervention that's been developed in these clinical settings, will it also be effective in a classroom setting implemented under realistic conditions, by a classroom teacher or paraprofessionals, as opposed to doctoral students in some university clinic? So those would be interesting research questions, very useful. You always have to ask the question, how will the study of this phenomena, this issue, contribute to the research literature? What will it add? If you can't answer that question, then you need to go back, because that's the purpose of research, is to always add to the body of knowledge that we have. This parallels the text. There's some questions you always need to ask about any research question. The first is it feasible? Is this something that you can actually do? Back when I did a postdoc at the University of Utah, one of my students was doing her master's thesis, and she taught early childhood classes. So she worked with really young kids, and she knew from experience that kids that exhibited certain kinds of problems or issues, and she had written down things like impulse control, the ability to delay any kind of gratification, a tendency to always blame things on other people. She had these characteristics that she believed contributed to kids getting into a lot of trouble later on, like when they got into high school. So she was interested in studying these early characteristics and how they might predict going to basically getting in trouble with the law when someone's 18 or 19. I had a discussion with her, and I said, that's really a fascinating study, but for a master's thesis, that's not feasible. First of all, you'd have to start out, you could do a longitudinal study, and you could work with 3 and 4-year-olds and then wait 17 years and see where they were. Shouldn't have that much time for a master's. The other thing you could do is you could look at people now who are 17 and 18, and then look back at when they were 3 and 4, were they engaging in these kinds of behaviors? And she did start looking at that, and she realized that data didn't exist. There were no good records going back that far, at least at that point in time. So we decided that even though that was potentially a very important research idea, at least for her, that wasn't something that was feasible right now. So she ended up looking at interventions for those behaviors and whether or not she could use some strategies to improve them in kids. The other question is it innovative? Is the study actually going to build on what's already known about something? So in her case, she looked at interventions that were available for early childhood at the time. This was about 20 years ago. And she found that a lot of the interventions that her district was using were not evidence-based or research-based. They were sort of, feel-good kinds of things. And she realized that it was important to implement interventions for these young children that were function-based. So her study ended up, she did functional behavior assessments for these 3 and 4-year-olds, and then she taught function-based interventions that were related to communication skills and social skills. Now, since that time, that's been done a lot, and right now that wouldn't be an innovative study. 20 years ago, it was very innovative because doing function-based interventions for really young children. Early childhood was predominantly the developmental model, and she had a lot of difficulty convincing her supervisors that this was something that was going to be helpful for the children. They were very developmental and constructivist oriented, and they didn't like, she had to avoid using the term behavioral actually. So it was something that was very innovative and it was feasible. Is the question clear? So the research question should be, it should lead very directly to the decisions that we're going to make about how the study is going to be conducted. And 2 or 3 or 4 people should be able to read it and know exactly what that question is asking. The research question should include information about what you're going to measure and how you expect that intervention to affect that measure. So they're very succinct and they're very short. And then finally, is the question ethical? So we may have a research question that it's very feasible and it's innovative and it's clear, but maybe it really exposes the participants to a high level of risk, and the potential benefit for the individuals participating in the study is very low. And that would be an unethical research study, because you're exposing people to risk without giving them the opportunity to really gain anything or benefit from it. So an example would be, let's use a historical Milgram experiment that you may be familiar with. This was back in the 1970s. A social psychologist did studies, and he looked at rule following in adults. And just to summarize it really quickly, they did a ruse. The participants thought that they were shocking an individual, and they believed that the purpose of the study was the effect of punishment on learning. So when a person got something wrong, this was a person that was not actually being shocked, they were told to push buttons that increased a level of shock that they believed that person was getting. And at one point, at a certain point, the participant, the confederate, the person that was supposed to be getting shocked, started begging them not to do it, and started, screaming that they were being hurt. And the person in a lab coat was being very authoritative and saying, no, you are to continue, increase the voltage. And they found that under those conditions, a lot of people actually listened to the authoritative person and continued to shock the individual, even when the person was, begging them to stop and saying they were being hurt. And as a result of that, the people who participated in that study had some significant emotional side effects, as you would imagine. They got very upset, and so that would be very difficult to do that study now. And it's used as an example when you complete the human subjects research training. They'll probably use it as an example. So that's clearly unethical. Personally, I will not engage in any research unless I can see a very clear benefit to the participants. I think it's unethical just to mess with people and use them as guinea pigs. So I won't do research unless the people who are involved in the research are going to get clear benefit from it. Research questions have 3 elements. All research questions do, regardless of the type of research design. So in this course, we're focusing on single case research, but all research questions will include the participants, young children with autism, adolescents with emotional and behavioral disorders, general education middle school students. So there's the group of participants that are being defined in the question. Every research question has independent variables, or an independent variable, at least one. Usually more than one. Now, as you remember, the independent variable is the actual intervention that we're studying. It's so a good way to remember that is I independent, I intervention. Research questions will always have dependent variables. Quantitative research studies, at any rate. The dependent variable is what you're measuring. So the way I learned that, D for dependent, D for data. So I, intervention, D, data. So you be sure that any question you write includes these three elements. Who are you studying? You're studying the effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable, and your question is worded so that it's expressing very clearly that for these individuals, you're going to want to see if this intervention has this effect. Sometimes research questions have, research studies have more than one question. So I'm going to encourage you to really focus. For the research question assignment, I want you to limit it to 2, actually. You may come up, if somebody has 3, that's not going to be a problem, but don't try to come up with multiple questions right away. But it's very common, as you start reading more studies, you're going to see that they actually sometimes have multiple questions. Don't get carried away. I know from being on dissertation and thesis committees, sometimes students come up with like way too many questions to be involved. Usually you're going to have a research question related to each of your dependent variables. For example, a real common set of research questions related to instructional interventions is equivalence-based learning, or are equivalence-based teaching strategies effective for 3rd and 4th grade students with autism spectrum disorder? So that could be a general question. Well, how are you going to measure effectiveness? One of them might be the rate of acquisition or learning of untrained skills. So with equivalence-based learning, remember that's based on stimulus equivalence. So if we're teaching, one association, like the word fox with a picture of a fox, and then we pair the picture of a fox with a spoken word fox, then the transitive association the person's going to learn is that written word is also equivalent to the spoken word, or the pair that wasn't taught directly. So we could look at the acquisition of those transitive associations. That would be one measure. The other thing we could do is we could look at the efficiency of learning. Does it, for example, if we're comparing equivalence-based strategies to associative strategies like discrete trial instruction, and we just directly teach all of those skills, does that ultimately result in learning with fewer instructional trials? So we could look at the number of instructional trials to criterion and also the percentage correct, and those would be 2 dependent measures, and we could have a research question related to those 2. So typically the research questions are related and they're linked to dependent variables. There are different types of research questions. So as you come up with a question, I want you to decide which type it is. Demonstration questions are research questions typically if something's early in field, if a study is early. In other words, this is something there hasn't been a lot of research in. The first questions are always just about, does this actually work? And that's what a demonstration question does. It just, will this intervention have this effect on the dependent variable for this group of participants? So some examples might be, will the use of video modeling improve independent task completion of vocational skills by individuals with developmental disabilities? So that's just a straightforward question. Can we identify the elements in it? So who are the participants? The participants are individuals with developmental disabilities. What's the independent variable? The independent variable is the intervention. That would be video modeling. What's the dependent variable? Independent task completion of vocational skills. So it has all of the elements it needs, but it's a very straightforward question. For many of you, I'm going to encourage you to maybe stick to this type of question for this course because it's simpler. Again, the issue would be what you're interested in, but for many of you, this may be a good choice. Or the other example, will social stories improve social skills of children with autism in inclusive classrooms? So it's got, I forgot the setting, it's also that one. So with the demonstration question, for this week, I want you to participate in a discussion board. So for each type of question, I've got a little scenario here, and I want you to work on phrasing this into a type of research question. And then I want you to, I know we haven't really covered research designs yet, but just what type of research design, looking ahead, we have multiple baseline designs, alternating treatment designs, ABAB or multi-element designs. What kind of research design at this point do you think might be effective in answering this question? Again, I'm not real picky here, but I just want you to start looking ahead and thinking about it. So here's the scenario. Mary Ann teaches third grade in an urban school district. She notices that children appear tired and inattentive following lunch. She wonders if a short rest period following lunch might increase attentiveness. So how would you phrase that in a research question? Well, think about it and then post that on the discussion board for this week. Also consider, what design might you use? Other type of research question is a comparison question. So with a comparison question, you have two independent variables, two types of interventions, and you're asking a question, does one of these work better than the other, or are they both effective? And typically, you're interested if one is going to work better. So for this kind of research question, we've got to be careful about the kind of research design. We've got to have a research design that will allow us to use two independent variables. Couple of examples. Will video-based instruction using self-models be more effective than using other models? So self-model would be the actual participant in the video, and then other models would be someone else, another person. It could be another peer, classmate. So, for example, I did a study with Erica Pinter, and we looked at a kid that was in math group having disruptive behavior, and then we had kids that were his age serving as peer models with participation in math group. So that was just a demonstration study. A follow-up could be, we've seen that peer models can be effective, but would self-models be more effective? So we could do a study and compare self-model to peer models and look at the effects on social skills. So in that case, we might have the same dependent variable. Actually, you always do. You have to have the same dependent variable, and you're looking with your research question at, does one intervention cause more of a change in this dependent variable than the other? Or another would be, will whole language approaches improve reading fluency of first graders more than direct instruction? Or a more timely one might be, would core vocabulary interventions increase communication skills of children with autism more than PECS instruction? So you could compare core vocabulary and PECS to see which one would have the greatest influence on spontaneous communication. So that would be another comparison study. So here's your comparison study scenario. Gillian teaches 7th grade science in middle school students in a suburban district. He's noticed that a few students are not turning in their homework assignments. He wonders if emailing parents the schedule of assignments would be more effective than emailing students with a schedule of assignments. So how would you phrase this as a research question? And what type of research design might you use? So that's another one for you to post on the discussion board. Another type of research question that's a little more complex is a parametric question. So with a parametric question, you have one independent variable, but you're interested in comparing or looking at different levels of this independent variable and how it might affect your dependent variable. For example, I know that a few years ago, the folks out at UCLA with the clinic that was started by Ivar Lovaas were recommending 30 to 40 hours a week of programming for children with autism. And there were a series of studies that compared different amounts of different hours. So it would be 5 hours of programming a week versus 15 hours versus 25 hours or something like that. So the dependent variable would be some measure of learning, correct performance or acquisition, and then the independent variable is presented at different levels, and you're comparing those three. So I did something similar to that with my with my doctoral dissertation. I looked at kids who engaged in stereotypy, and that I had different levels of movement activity I incorporated into instruction, and I looked at how each level affected the kid's level of stereotypy. And what I saw is that the more movement that was introduced, the lower the level of stereotypy. So here's a couple of examples. What momentary time sampling size will result in more accurate measurement of behavior? 1 minute, 5 minutes, or 30 minutes? The other would be, what effect will 5 seconds or 15 seconds versus 45 seconds of escape from instruction have on the rate of negatively reinforced behavior? So, for example, this could be, if let's say that we're teaching a kid to request a break as an alternative behavior, and then when they get a break for 5 seconds, and then we're comparing that to 15 seconds versus 45 seconds. So which would be more effective? There's other ways you could work this study, but that's one that would actually benefit the kid. We're not just reinforcing some bad behavior. So I think the study's actually been done, and I think they found that it was somewhere in the middle. If it was too short, like 5 seconds, it just frustrated the kid. And then if it was really long, like 5 minutes, it was harder to get the kid back on task. But something, short, like a minute or 2 minutes, was actually more effective for the kid. I'd have to go back and look at it, but that would be a really interesting parametric type study. So here's a parametric scenario that I'd like you to phrase in a research question for the discussion board. So Ginger's interested in using video modeling to teach her students proper cafeteria behavior. She's wondering if they need to view videos while they're in the cafeteria, which would be concurrent presentation, or the period before going to the cafeteria, like less than an hour before the cafeteria, they watch a video, or can they watch videos first thing in the morning? And then will that still improve their behavior at lunch? So that would be an interesting parametric type question. So how can you take this and phrase it in a research question? Again, it's not that hard because it's almost a research question as it's written. It's just going to be a little more concise. And then what type of research design might you be able to use? Finally, some research questions, we're interested in what aspect or what piece of it is actually contributing the most. This is usually done later. So when you're looking at a new area of research, the first studies are always, or most often, demonstration studies, because it's the basic question is, will this work? Then you start to see more of the other types of questions pop up in research, like comparison studies. Okay, we know this works, but does it work better than the stuff we're already doing? So you might get some comparison studies, and then you get, okay, it works, and it does work better than what we're already doing, but how much of it do we need? So that would be the parametric type question. And then component analysis questions answer the question of, okay, is there one piece of this, or do we have to implement the whole package? So, for example, social stories, if you read, Carol, can't remember her name, right? Carol Gray. She came up with the whole idea of social studies, and then she has a formula that you need like so many declarative statements or descriptive statements and directive statements, and for it to be an effective social story. So a component analysis might be, we're going to look at social stories, but what if we remove one of those components at a time? Will the social story still be effective? And which components actually might be working, or do you need all the pieces together? The research actually shows that social stories are really just rule-governed behavior, and kids that respond to them respond to rule-governed behavior. Rule-governed behavior has been reinforced as an operant. So a component analysis would be, will adding video feedback to social stories improve social skills of students with behavioral challenges? So what you would have to do with that is you have a social story that includes video feedback, and then compare that to social story without video feedback, or some other component. There may be some overlap. What you should probably recognize just now is that a comparison study. Yeah, sort of, because you'd be comparing social stories with a video feedback to social stories without video feedback. So in that case, you probably would use the same design that you would use for a comparison study, but it's still a component analysis because you're looking at the same intervention with one piece added and taken away. Whether it's with a comparison study, it may be two completely different interventions. Functionally, though, in that case, it would be pretty similar. Will the removal of rule statements from the good behavior game change the frequency of students' problem behavior? So the rule statements, part of the good behavior game, is that really necessary? Or you could look at what schedule of reinforcement with a good behavior game works. So for example, if you had a schedules of reinforcement with different values, that would be a parametric study. But in this case, if we just take the rule statement out and then put the rule statement in, we're looking at that component. Sometimes component analyses they can get pretty complicated. They can compare three different components, or they can remove one component at a time, and then you're looking at three different ones. Those get really complicated. So if you want to go this route, I'm going to suggest you just look at one component. Component analyses are really important, and sometimes they show that we don't need all the pieces of a package, or sometimes they're useful in identifying which pieces are really critical. Okay, here's a component analysis type question that I'd like you to post on the discussion board. So the scenario is, Skipper is a vocational coordinator at a large high school. He currently has his students with more significant disabilities using a visual assistant on a handheld device to prompt them through their vocational task. It presents both auditory and picture-based sequences of tasks. He's wondering if the auditory cues are necessary in prompting independent functioning of his students. So, are the auditory cues necessary, or do you just need the visual cues? So, that would be a good component analysis question. How would you phrase that as a research question? And what are the three elements in the research question? So, look back at the beginning of the presentation. What are the elements that are present in all research questions, and can you identify them for this research question? So that's what you would post on the discussion board this week. So for your research question assignment, I know I had an earlier PowerPoint that you might have seen that said it's due on 6/10. That was from the old version. It's actually due on 6/5 this semester. And again, I realize that this is early on. You're going to get feedback on this. So try to narrow it down, but realize that this is probably something you're going to adapt later on. So it's due on 6/5. Turn it in as a Word document or a PDF. Doesn't matter, but it needs to be one of those formats. For the assignment, I want you to write just a brief statement I said overview, but this is very short, maybe just a few sentences, of what's your topic of interest and what's the issue that you're planning to address. So this is pretty broad at this point. What are some ways that you propose that you might address this issue or solve the problem? And then can you write 2 research questions related to the topic? So just 2. If you really, you can't help yourself, write 3, but I'm just asking for 2. For each question, I want you to identify the elements. What's the dependent variable? What's the independent variable? And what are the participants? And it would probably be a good idea to identify what type of research question do you believe you have. Is this a component analysis? Is it a demonstration question? Is it a parametric question? What type of research question is it? I don't think I put that in the assignment, but that's a good way to think as well, because that's going to have some implications for the type of research design that you use. The next section just deals with considerations for single case design. So the way you answer these questions will guide you in selecting the research design that's a good fit for you, what research design fits your question best. So we're not going to pick a research design right now, but these are things that we need to start thinking about. So will the dependent variable, that's what you're measuring, associated with your study involve participants learning a specific skill, or will the dependent variable involve a measure of some challenging behavior? Now the reason there is if you're teaching a skill, that rules out an ABAB design or reversal design because the skill's not unlearned. If it's a challenging behavior that's going to respond to an intervention, then you could use an ABAB type design. If the dependent variable is associated with learning a skill, you'd expect your participants to retain the skill after instruction. So, yeah, what I just said. Next thing is, will it be feasible to implement your independent variables sequentially across 3 or more settings, skills, or participants? So this is sort of asking, is it something that you might consider a multiple baseline design? Multiple baseline designs can be used for skills because you're implementing it sequentially across different skills. So we wouldn't be able to use an ABAB design, could use a multiple baseline design for that setting. They're also I like multiple baseline designs because you don't have to remove an intervention for behavior once it's in place. It also fits in really naturally with the way we implement intervention. So if I'm implementing an intervention with a student with challenging behavior, most often I'll start out in one setting where I have the most control, and then I'm gradually going to implement that intervention in different settings. So they work really well in applied settings. The next issue is, does your research question involve comparing 2 or more independent variables? So do you have a comparison type study? If you do, probably not a multiple baseline design, more of an alternating treatment design in that case. The next question is, does your research question involve assessing the effects of adding or removing different elements of an independent variable and measuring the effect? Well, that would be a component analysis. Or does your research question involve incrementally increasing or decreasing levels of an independent variable and measuring the effects of changes in the dependent variable? So that would be more of a parametric type question. So these questions are sort of, the point is to get you to think about how should you go about answering this question? What type of question do you have, and what kind of research design may be a good fit as we start looking at those later on. And what I'd like you to do, this isn't something that you're going to be turning in, but in the article analysis assignment, when people start selecting articles, they typically want to find review articles. Review articles are when an author has looked at a bunch of studies and they analyze across studies. They're attractive because they provide a summary of what's known in a field. And I think it'd be important for you if you could find some review articles related to your area of interest, definitely read them. They are not the studies I want you to use in the article analysis, though, because they don't report on the results of a single research study. They look at data across studies. What I want you to do is I want you to primarily find articles that are intervention or that are actual studies. People will often find group design studies too, and group designs are great, but they typically address different kinds of research questions than single case studies. As we're going to learn, single case research is really not, we don't do studies with just one person, and they're not case studies, but they're more within subject designs. A person serves as his or her own control. So for the first 5 articles, 4 of them have to be single case research articles. One can be a group design study because there's some, it may be important information. It's certainly okay if all 5 are single case research design studies. I'd actually encourage you to do that, because as you read those studies, I want you to look at the research questions. So as you read in each of these studies, can you find the research question, look at the research design they used, and look at how that research design addresses the research question. Start paying attention to that as you read articles. And by the time you read all 10 articles for your article analysis assignment, you should have a pretty good idea of how these research designs link up to specific questions. So that should give you, what you need to start honing down a research question. Again, I don't expect this to be perfect. For this assignment, if I see that you've genuinely thought about a research question, you've made a genuine effort, I'm going to give you the 25 points. If it looks like you just didn't think about it much, then I may have some problems with it. But typically, I'm very generous with points on this assignment. The key is to get you thinking about your research question, what you would be measuring, what type of design you might use. So that's the purpose of this assignment. If you do run into any questions, certainly email me with them, and I'm happy to help you. But I'd really like you to think this through yourself as much as possible, to start thinking like a researcher. Any questions, though, just let me know.